I want to say one thing. These guys are pretty serious players in our industry. We provide links from this website to their websites. Take a look at what Trace Meyer has to say at his website, runtogold.com.
Welcome back to episode 76 of the runtogold.com podcast. Last week I wrote an article and mentioned the sacrosanct socio new look at Abraham Lincoln, his agenda, and an unnecessary war, and also the book Lincoln Unmasked, What You're Not Supposed to Know About Dishonest Abe. So when we're talking about this great, revered American president, what are some of the things that are hidden about him? What are these things that we're not supposed to know about President Lincoln?
Well, one of the things you're not supposed to know is what he said in his first inaugural address, where he pledged his support for a constitutional amendment that would have prohibited the federal government from ever interfering with slavery. And so in his first inaugural, he was satisfied with enshrining slavery in the Constitution explicitly. It had never been explicitly in the Constitution. And in that same speech, he threatened a war over tax collection. He said, "It is my duty to collect the duties and imposts," which is tariffs, but beyond that, there be no invasion of any state. So he literally threatened a war and carried out his threat, of course, by invading the southern states over tax collection. And that's not taught in school. That's one thing. He illegally suspended the writ of habeas corpus and imprisoned tens of thousands of northern civilians. He shut down over 300 opposition newspapers. He deported an outspoken Democratic Party member of Congress named Clement Vallandigham from Ohio. And he confiscated firearms in the states in violation of the Second Amendment. And he basically started the war without the permission of Congress. And so that's why some historians call Lincoln a dictator, but they say he was a good dictator.
Oh, yeah, because they're apologizing perhaps for having a strong federal government and violating some of perhaps the 10th Amendment and a lot of those things. So when we're looking at Lincoln and his, you kind of started with these gross violations of private property rights. Really, the Civil War was about collecting taxes, you could say. It didn't have anything to do with slavery.
Well, it had something to do with slavery because the Lincoln and the Republican Party opposed only the extension of slavery into the new territories. They never opposed Southern slavery. In fact, as I just mentioned, Lincoln promised an ironclad constitutional protection of slavery. And of course, slavery was already protected by the Constitution. The Southern states did not have to secede to protect slavery. It was already constitutional. There were no challenges, in the courts to slavery. And I wish there were. I wish we could have ended it peacefully, like all the other countries of the world did at the time, but we did not. And so the basic cause of the war, though, was that the Southern states thought that they were sovereign and they had a right to be in the Union or not be in the Union. Lincoln was the first American president ever to take the position that the federal government had a right to literally invade, wage war on his own country to stop them from seceding. The New England Federalists threatened to secede in the early part of the 19th century. They even held a convention in Hartford, Connecticut in the year 1814 to vote up or down on secession. And there was little discussion about whether it was illegal or not. Just about everyone assumed it certainly was legal because the states were sovereign. And so that's really what the war was about. Are the states sovereign, or is the government of Washington the master of us all? And that's, of course, when the North won the war, it proved that the government of Washington is our master and no longer our servant.
Yeah, and it was a very accepted doctrine that the states had the right to secede back then, especially, I guess, Lysander Spooner was one of the people that argued quite a bit in favor of these states' rights, because how else can you have a government that governs with the consent of the governed unless the people have the right to leave, or the states in this case?
That's right. All you have to do to convince yourself that is to read Article 7 of the U.S. Constitution, which says that the Constitution will be ratified by 9 of the 13 states at the time. It didn't say the U.S. government will ratify the states. It said the states will ratify the Constitution, granting delegated powers to the U.S. government. And those powers were supposed to be used for the benefit of the people of the states. The original system was that if the people were ever to be in charge or sovereign, in control of their own government, the way in which they would do it would be through political communities organized at the state and local level. That's how we were supposed to be the masters rather than the servants of our own government, our own central government. And that was understood by everybody. Like I said, there was the New England Federalist talked about secession. There was a secession movement in the Middle Atlantic states in the 1850s, and even some of the famous abolitionists of the North proposed that New England secede from the South because they did not want to be a part of a country that still had slavery. Although I think, we need to keep in mind that there were still slaves in New York City as late as 1853. So, and that's not too far off from the Civil War era.
Yeah. So when we look at Lincoln, it appears that ironically he extended slavery to all people in the Americas instead of actually abolishing it. And in his erosion of these essential checks and balances in the political machinery that we've been talking about, you hit on it in the beginning. His gross violations of the Great Writ, the writ of habeas corpus. Can you explain a little bit about what the writ of habeas corpus is, and then delve into what he did with his interference with the federal courts and also with Ex parte Milligan?
Well, it's the one thing in the Constitution that guarantees our personal liberty, and whenever the government accuses us of a crime, we have a right to due process. We have a right to confront our accusers. We have a right to a speedy trial by a jury of our peers and so forth. But when Lincoln lifted that, he had the army, literally break down the doors of houses of people and drag them off into some dungeon somewhere in a gulag. And there were tens of thousands of people. And it included the mayor of Baltimore, the grandson of Francis Scott Key, who wrote the Star-Spangled Banner. He was a newspaper editor who was opposing all of this, and a lot of prominent citizens. These weren't spies. These weren't Confederate spies. They were just Northern citizens who were criticizing the Lincoln administration, and they were imprisoned by the tens of thousands. And so as far as Ex parte Milligan goes, after the Civil War in 1866, Lincoln is dead. The Supreme Court finally had a great ruling where they said that it was illegal for either Lincoln or the Congress to have suspended habeas corpus as long as the civil courts were operating in the North, which they were. And they said that it is especially during wartime that we need to guard our civil liberties and our constitutional liberties, because that's when they are most threatened. I mean, when there's some kind of emergency. And so they took the exact opposite tack of what Lincoln himself said, essentially suspending the Constitution. They said it's most important during an emergency like war to protect the Constitution, and I think that's one of the finest statements ever made by a Supreme Court in terms of constitutional liberty.
Yeah, so you had Lincoln, and I think what was his argument? He said, if we have to cut off the arm to save the body, then it's good. But
yeah.
so the Supreme Court battled with Lincoln over the Great Writ of habeas corpus. And what is this about Lincoln issuing an arrest warrant for the Chief Justice?
Yes, in my book Lincoln Unmasked, I read about how Lincoln, the Chief Justice of the United States, Roger B. Taney, issued an opinion that Lincoln's suspension of habeas corpus was illegal because the government can do it, but the Congress has to do it. And Lincoln responded by issuing an arrest warrant for Taney. And I cite several impeachable sources on that, including a former Supreme Court justice, among other people. And so he did that. It's really an act of tyranny. It's an attack on the separation of powers. And I also document in my book, Lincoln Unmasked, that Lincoln also sent soldiers to arrest other federal judges, not just Taney, but other judges who were about to issue writs of habeas corpus, that is, that would give people accused of a crime their day in court. And so this was not just an intimidation of Roger B. Taney. It was an intimidation of a lot of other federal judges as well that went on during the Lincoln administration.
Oh, yeah, because he would actually station troops outside of their homes to prevent them from going to meet in session, right?
Yes, that's what happened. I got out of the archive, the National Archives, a letter from a federal judge explaining to his fellow federal judges why he did not show up in court that day. He said he got home and his home was surrounded by armed soldiers who kept him, essentially kidnapped him in his own home and kept him from going to court to issue the writ of habeas corpus. And I have to believe that that was not the lone incident of that sort. And Lincoln essentially redefined treason to mean anyone who disagreed with him. So if you read Article 3, Section 3 of the U.S. Constitution, which defines treason, it says waging war against the states or giving aid and comfort to their enemy. And so literally Lincoln's invasion of the southern states was the very definition of treason under the U.S. Constitution. Just read, anyone can read Article 3, Section 3, and you'll know that I'm right about this.
And so it's kind of like terrorism. When I was in law school, I took a counterterrorism class, and of course we can't define it, and it seems to be terrorism is anything that opposes me. And so Lincoln, who was engaged in perhaps the bloodiest episode of terrorism in the United States, he did it definitely in violation of the Constitution, and it's great that you've done a lot of the research on these things to expose a little bit of the revisionist history surrounding this historical figure, because it appears that every country loves their dictators. You know, you've got Stalin and he's pickled, and you've got Mao and he's pickled, and last time I was in Beijing, you know, you had lines of people to go and see Chairman Mao, who, like Lincoln, definitely increased the per capita GDP by reducing the denominator. So we see the same thing with Lincoln. We have this giant Lincoln Memorial in D.C. To this person who really didn't do very nice things to the people of the United States.
Well, one of the things that Americans don't know either is that all the other countries of the world that ended slavery did it peacefully, and that includes the northern states. There were no wars of emancipation in Pennsylvania or Illinois or Massachusetts. Everyone in the world found a way pragmatically to get rid of slavery without mass murder and mass killing. There were over 650,000 people died, including some 50,000 Southern civilians during the Civil War. And that's, if you standardize for today's population, that would be the equivalent of over 6 million Americans dying today in 4 years. And if you put it that way, why didn't we end slavery peacefully? Well, the main reason is the war wasn't about ending slavery. I don't think you'd find a historian who would tell you that Lincoln invaded to free the slaves. He didn't. He very clearly said, in fact, that his purpose was to save the Union, not to do anything about the slaves. Although, of course, I argue that he actually destroyed the voluntary union of the Founding Fathers and replaced it with a Soviet-style mandatory union.
Well, thank you very much. This has been an enlightening interview, and I'm sure we'll have you back again on the RunToGold.com podcast, perhaps to discuss Alexander Hamilton.
This is John Rubino from DollarCollapse.com, and you're listening to Run to Gold.